The Catholic Counter-Reformation. Although the Protestant Reformation was an undeniable force of revolution, the Catholic Church endured. Although pieces of the Church crumbled in northern Germany, Switzerland, Bohemia, Scandinavia, England, and Scotland, the dense mass remained in southern Germany, Italy, Poland, Lithuania, Spain, France, and Ireland. But after 20 years on their heels, the Catholic Church struck back. First off, a reforming spirit within the church, where Catholic followers wanted to emphasize that they were practicing God's true Christianity, became the foundation for a host of new religious orders. The Capuchins, organized in central Italy, they were organized in central Italy and had the blessing of the Pope. It was a religious order that sought to return to the original principles of poverty and piety, emphasized by St. Francis of Assisi. The second were the Theatines. They were a society of priests whose mission was to improve the level of education and discipline among the clergy. The third, the Ursulines. They were an order of nuns dedicated to the education of girls. The discalced, barefoot Carmelites were the fourth, founded by St. Teresa of Avila. They emphasized nuns living a life of poverty and simplicity, devoted to prayer and contemplation. Most importantly of the new groups of the Counter-Reformation were the fifth group, the Jesuits. At first sight, Ignatius of Loyola appears unlikely to spearhead the Catholic Reformation. Born of a Spanish noble family, he was a career soldier. During a battle against the French in 1521, a cannonball shattered his leg, and he was carried home for a long recovery. Out of boredom, he read all of the books he could in his castle, all dealing with religion. After reading a book about the sufferings of martyrs and saints, he decided to give his life to God. He resolved to model his life on the sufferings of the saints he read about. He gave away all of his possessions, and he deprived himself of food and sleep for long periods. He prayed for 7 hours a day. Like Luther, Loyola was tormented by his inability to achieve salvation. But unlike Luther, he became even more brutal in his self-mutilation. He recorded much of his devotion in the Spiritual Exercises, which became a handbook for Catholic devotion. In 1523, crippled and barefoot, he made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem where he intended to stay and battle the Muslims. He was dissuaded and returned to Spain, intent upon becoming a priest. By this time, his eccentricities were well documented. Twice, the Spanish Inquisition summoned him to be examined for heresy. He studies at the University of Orleans right after John Calvin had left. However, Protestant ideas had little attraction for him. After becoming a priest, he and a small group of friends decide to form a brotherhood devoted to the cure of souls, and took personal vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience to Rome. After once again being called to the Inquisition, this time to Rome itself, Loyola explains to Paul III his mission, who blesses them as the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. The Jesuits were organized along military lines, and the head of the society was known as the general. Emphasis was placed on obedience to authority. The Jesuits dedicated themselves to combating the spread of Protestantism. They recovered Poland from the Calvinists. They also preserved the Catholic faith in southern Germany. In addition, the Jesuits worked in the education of youth and established some of Europe's best universities. Missionary work was also key for the Jesuits, traveling to the most remote areas of the globe. The Jesuits represented an aggressive Catholic response that was determined to meet Protestantism head-on and repel it. Old instruments like the Inquisition were revived completely, and the new weapons like the Index of Prohibited Books were formed. The emperor and the hierarchy of the German church, where Protestantism was the strongest, demanded thorough reform of the Catholic Church. The Pope and the hierarchy of the Italian church, where Protestantism was virtually non-existent, resisted the call. Even though Charles V was one of the most Catholic rulers in Europe, he was mortal enemies of the papacy in everything else. Finally, after 2 decades of arguing over politics, the makeup of reforming councils, to the location of the meetings, the General Council of the Church that finally met in Trent from 1545 to 1563. It had all the makings for disaster. Even though it began in compromise, Trent being an Italian town under the rule of Charles V, the papacy dominated Trent from the start. Fewer than a third of the delegates came from outside of Italy. The French looked upon the council suspiciously due to the fact that much of Italy was under Spanish occupation. Yet, for all of these difficulties, the Council of Trent made some real progress. They corrected a number of abuses, of which the sale of indulgences was the most crucial. They formulated rules for the better regulation of parish priests and stressed the obligation of priests and bishops to preach to their congregations. On the heels of the successes of the Jesuits, they ordered seminaries founded in all dioceses where there was not already a university so that priests could receive sufficient education. They prepared a new modern and uniform Catholic service. They centralized and updated the index of prohibited books to include Protestant writings from all over the continent. One thing the Council of Trent did not do, however, was compromise with any Protestant. Although Protestant theologians attended a few of the council's sessions, their views were totally repudiated. Justification by faith and good works was confirmed, as was the observance of Scripture and Catholic tradition. They reaffirmed the seven sacraments. They upheld the clerical celibacy. This redefinition of a traditional Catholic dogma ended decades of confusion, but it also meant that the differences between Catholics and Protestants could now be settled by the sword.